For the limiting reaction with beans activity, we're going to use the white beans and red beans. So I have determined the mass per dozen. I took 3 dozen of them and divided the grams by the 3 dozen, and I get the grams per dozen. So this is the grams per dozen that we will use for each one. And therefore, if we use 1 white and 2 red to make 1 cup of soup, 1 tiny cup, then a cup would be 27.9 grams per dozen cups. So we will take, if we took 13.7 grams of white, dividing by the fact that it's 13.7 grams per dozen, we would be using 1 dozen cups. So taking the fact that it's 13.7 grams per dozen, and it's 1 cup per 1 white, it's 1 cup per 1 white. Using 13.7 grams, we would be getting 1 dozen cups of soup. That's the max product we could make. Using the fact that it's 7.1 grams per dozen for red, but it's 2 reds per cup, it's 2 reds per cup. If you have 1 dozen red, because this is 1 dozen, right? You'll only be able to make half a dozen cups of soup. So in reality, what can you make? Well, you can either make 1 dozen or half a dozen. And at this point, the big number is wrong. The small number is right, like we did with the other activities. So we'll cross this out. We'll use the smaller number. When I make half a dozen cups at 27.9 dozen, I should get 13.9 grams of cups of soup. And that means that we are using up all the red beans this time. So let's find out what would be left over, and then we're going to compare this all in real beans. If I use half a dozen cups, I know the whites are left over because I can't use all the whites. I said I was going to use all the reds, and I'll have whites left over. Half a dozen cups, using whites at 1 white per 1 cup, and 13.7 grams per dozen, means I will use this many grams of white. So what's left over? Well, I know what I started with, and I know what I used, and so by subtraction, I know what's left over. So let's actually do it. Here is my 13.7, or really close, grams of white beans. Here is my 7.1 grams of red beans, well, as close as I can get anyway. Here are my beans divided out into 2 red, 1 white. So each one of these is a tiny cup of soup. I know I have 1 bean left over, but remember when I was slightly over the grams for red beans? So because beans are a variable product, they're not mass manufactured, we might have to cheat a little bit. I'm going to ignore this extra bean, plus my mass was high anyway, so I'm just going to push that aside. And I have 6 cups of beans, 6 cups of soup here, and here are my extra beans. And what mass extra do I have? 7.1 grams. Well, even on just by math, I predicted 6.85 grams, so this is pretty good. Which beans ran out first? The red. Which beans are the excess reactant? White. What's the mass of the excess reactant beans that were actually used in the cup? What's the mass of the excess reactant beans that were actually used in the cups? Well, it's 6.6 grams. Subtract that out from the starting mass. So we started with 13.7 grams of white minus 6.6 grams used. And that's 7.1 grams left over. Does that come close to what we calculated? Yes, it does, because I predicted 6.85 and I got 7.1 left over.